You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome to The Open Door, a show based on the words in Revelation, "I have left an open door before you, which no one can close." This is WCAT Radio's longest-running show, which opened the door to the radio station in October 2016. It's currently offered by Jim Hanink, Mario Ramos-Reyes and friends, and remains open to the love of God in its call to build a culture of life and a just social order through the panel's discussion of the Catholic social teaching principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and economic democracy. The Open Door also explores nonviolence, distributism, and communitarianism. So join us at the Open Door, where you too can be part of the conversation.
Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hanink here with fellow panelists Mario Ramos-Reyes and Christopher Zehnder. Today we explore the philosophical and artistic legacy of St. John Paul II. Our welcome guest is Dr. Michael Healy. He recently authored a primer in the philosophy of John Paul II, in his own words, from En Route Books and Media 2021, our sponsor. Healy has served as the Dean of the Faculty at Franciscan University of Steubenville and interim president of Ave Maria College. As a full professor of philosophy at Franciscan University, he specializes in the philosophy of the person, ethics, existentialism, and philosophy of religion. He has a special love for Kierkegaard, von Hildebrand, and Wojtyla, interpreted in light of the philosophia perennis. Let's begin, as we always do, in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and enkindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who has taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that by the gift of the same Spirit we may be always truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Dr. Healy, Michael, if we may.
Yes, please.
Could you tell us a bit about yourself and how you came to Franciscan University?
Significant facts would be I'm married to a beautiful girl named Maria for 45 years, have 5 kids. I've been at Franciscan for 36 years. I got there by providence alone. Father Michael was looking for a new dean. He helped to try to renew the university. He became president in 1974, was trying to renew the university largely through the charismatic renewal. But along about the mid-'80s, thought he needed to ground the whole charismatic renewal more in the faith, in the traditions of the faith, when looking for a dean with a background more in Catholic orthodoxy. I was one of the ones that was interviewed and got the job. And I was curious about the charismatic renewal at the time, too. So when I came for the weekend, I went to every charismatic meeting and mass and festival of praise that I could to try to absorb what their atmosphere was. And through their devotion to the Holy Eucharist and the Holy Father and Mary, I thought it looked pretty good. So we joined forces.
I think you were right. Mario, what should you be asking him now that we have that introduction? He's stunned.
Sorry. I'm very curious. Yes. I'm very curious about personalism that I didn't find quite often that word in American academia. And when I came, I did my dissertation on personalism, but nobody was around to talk about that specific way of thinking. And so I know that you wrote a book thinking about personalism, thinking your students. And so how this idea came about and how your students are receiving that text, if I can ask that question.
Okay. I came to classical and medieval philosophy already at Loyola University in the early 70s by reading von Hildebrand and Kierkegaard and Newman. That was before John Paul II was very well known, but the whole approach was to go back to our original human experiences and further unpack them in a way that was more relevant. And I had philosophy and theology courses in my freshman, sophomore year that were good, and I got good grades and everything else, but they sort of didn't grab me. But it was through this more personalist approach that the whole tradition, classical and medieval philosophy with all the special terminology, it all opened up and seemed so relevant to me. So I went on to grad school at the University of Dallas and focused on this kind of an approach, a realist approach that nonetheless goes through a careful description of experience and of values, and discovered John Paul II then, and discovered other thinkers like Gabriel Marcel with a similar foundation. And I've found it works really well in reaching students of all kinds. Students with no interest in philosophy are touched because of the deep personal insights. I originally went into psychology as an undergraduate because I wanted to figure out human emotions, human happiness, girls. And I got confused in psychology with all the different approaches, behaviorism, Freudianism, humanism. I think our psych department here at Steubenville is much more healthy, but that's all I met when I was at Loyola. It was when I read von Hildebrand on man and woman and sexuality that it was like the greatest thing I'd studied in all my years at Loyola, and I went down that track. And so for students without a philosophical background, this sort of personalist approach really reaches them. And then I also find that students who come with already a great knowledge of or love of or tendency toward St. Thomas and the whole Thomistic tradition, because it's part of our Catholic heritage, they find that someone like Wojtyla can build bridges and enliven the whole tradition. So I find both the traditionalist kind of student and the modern kind of student can really be turned on by this sort of return to what's really given and rich in our experience. And that always involves marveling and wondering at the unsuspected depths of it all. So that's my initial shot there.
We're getting the picture. Christopher.
Yeah, I have a question about, because I'm curious about personalism, and sometimes I think there are a lot of different kinds of personalism. So I'm
That's
not
true, yeah.
So you said you said it's a return in philosophy to human experience in a way that is more relevant. Okay.
Yes,
I think I got you that correctly there. Aristotle talks about whenever he deals with trying to understand the world outside, he always begins, what do men say, right? Uh-huh. And St. Thomas talks about all knowledge begins with sense experience. Granted, there was a period of time where philosophy became quite corrupt, by the 16th century, where philosophers seem to be relying mostly on texts of other philosophers for their conclusions. But how does the kind of experience you're talking about with personalism differ, or does it differ from the kind of experience that St. Thomas talks about as the opening of philosophy?
Yeah. I think when I talk about a return to experience, or when what's called realist phenomenology talks about going back to the things in themselves, the real truth of that is just a breakthrough to the classical philosophical method. Reason has to be grounded in experience and what's really there, and be open to what's really there. That's already the approach of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and Augustine and Aquinas. I think the difference with John Paul II, for instance, compared to the majority of the Thomistic tradition, is rather than start with the most universal things in metaphysics and in epistemology, and then categorize man as a rational animal, as his place in the universals. What John Paul II wants to do is start with the person and ethics and use that as an avenue into the metaphysics. So he's very much grounded in classical and Thomistic realist metaphysics, but he doesn't start there, but starts with the person, his nature, his motivations, his calls, ethically, etc. And then through the person and ethics wants to open up the other fields of philosophy. And that just seems to interest people more immediately.
How does ethics, though, proceed if you don't define what the subject of ethics?
Oh, you have to. He's very much in line with that, but the books he writes are not so much ethics textbooks. When he writes The Acting Person and when he writes Love and Responsibility, he's trying to, I think, lay the foundations again, explain more deeply what are the grounds for traditional ethical conclusions and church teachings in terms of like ethical universals, in terms of conscience, in terms of moral obligation. And so he wants to start with, again, the classical idea that what makes man unique is he has a mind and self-consciousness and freedom and responsibility. And he agrees with all that, but he wants to come at it from within the human person and show how our inner experience meets with those universal teachings and confirms them and brings them alive. And similarly with ethics, when he talks about the acting person, he wants to bring out within my own experience those moments where I know immediately my responsibility. He uses this phrase, it's translated in different ways. When I come to a moral situation where I realize I could do this, but I don't have to. I may follow the moral law and not snitch money to go play video games like when I was 11 years old. Well, it wasn't video games in those days. It was the old machines. I realize I can do this, but I don't have to. I can follow the moral law or I can reject it. And he says at a moment like that, we experience from within our own responsibility, our own call to goodness, which we can say yes to no to. And so I think he's trying to provide the inner subjective confirmation of the objective teachings. And so it's not a case of just universal formal teachings being somehow imposed on the individual by some monolithic church or by some ethical theory. It's rather we can recognize from within, this is what the human being is called to, this is what fulfills. And so it's this interplay of the inner and the outer. And, the turn inward in philosophy, starting at least with Descartes, and culminating in false forms of personalism that sort of make a quasi-absolute about the consciousness. Wojtyla wants to critique all that and yet take what's good from this this further illumination of the greatness of the person, but put it in the context of a traditional understanding as well. Is that good enough? I don't want to get too...
Yeah, okay. I think I understand you.
Michael, you wrote your primer with your students in mind.
Yes.
And in your primer, you from time to time refer to the distinctive writing style of John Paul II. And a moment ago, you mentioned the acting person. I can remember an introduction to one of his books, Ken Schmidt's, say that even though he had taught philosophy for decades, he wasn't quite sure what was going on in the acting person.
Yes.
And he had to do a lot more digging before he found the key or keys to it. Tell me a little bit about the academic environment in which your students are, and how they didn't have your primer until just last year. How did they find the key that it took Ken Schmidt's a long time to find?
Well, I started teaching a course in the texts of Wojtyla maybe at least 20 years ago, and I've taught it many times. And early on, when I was assigning weekly readings and weekly response papers to those readings, I saw the students were really kind of lost in the acting person. And so I started doing follow-up summaries after I'd read their response papers and saw what different directions they were going. I did these follow-up summary interpretations, and then that developed into the idea that I should provide some guidelines before they try to wade through it. And so I put together gradually this book, but I had earlier incarnations of it that were just photocopied, and then this is sort of the final product. What's interesting about the acting person is he, in some ways, he seems to try to bring the whole book along with him on every page. And so in every subsection, he's reminding us of the whole that's gone before and what's coming. Because he doesn't want to deal with consciousness or will as if they're some separate things, but rather they're all grounded in the concrete body-soul unity of the individual. And so he's always coming back to these things. And so you have to be sort of very attentive to what's the new point he's trying to make in this subsection while he's bringing everything along. And then at the same time, besides that aspect, he sometimes makes sort of great leaps forward. He'll have sort of new insights that have not been fully explained out of what's gone before, and then he brings it all together again. So it's very dense. The joke among the seminarians in Poland was that if you don't study hard in the seminary, your purgatory is going to be to interpret the acting person for 100 years. And so even in the original Polish, it was complicated and difficult. And I think before John Paul II was able to fully put it in the final shape he might have wanted, he always was already named bishop and archbishop and other things. So it's kind of in an original form that's a little rough. And then the translation, of course, interprets it one or another way. And the first translation wasn't the best. And so Father Stitchin, who was John Paul II's collaborator, Father Stitchin and JP2 put together a bunch of corrections of the original translation, but they never made it before the first printing. So the edition I was using back until this new translation came out was also not as clear, but nonetheless, the version with all the written incorrections was published in the Analecta Husserliana, and that's the one I use. And so I do have all the corrections, but it's amazing that John Paul II had the kind of a mind that could write the highest level, most difficult kind of philosophical investigations, and then he could go out and speak to 2 million young people at a World Youth Day and get them all excited and enthused and understanding, So he was remarkable in both directions, the highest level intellect and the greatest ability to reach people. I think that is a remarkable combination.
Now, you have a Loyola background. It's now Loyola Marymount, but there were 3 teachers in the philosophy department that used the acting person as a text. Not so often as you have, but there were 3 of us, and one of them, do you remember Carol Curley?
Oh, yes. He was chair when I was there. He told me he used it for his freshmen. I was amazed.
He told me when I was thinking of using it and finally did, he said, there is not a single example in this book.
Well, there's some truth in that. Yeah, that it's really heavy philosophy and not a lot of corroborating examples. And I'm not sure exactly why, except that was the audience he was writing to. He wasn't trying to reach the world with that book, but I think the highest level thinkers. Of course, he's marvelous at examples, and that comes through in his more popular talks. And of course, it comes through in his dramas that he first got into when he went to the university in 1938, the year before the Nazis invaded. He studied Polish letters, and then when the Nazis became involved in this clandestine theater group, the Rhapsodic Theater, where through drama, he already begins to present various themes that will later become very prominent in his philosophy about the inner workings of the person when he's faced with deep and intimate decisions to make about his life and meaning and about love and relationship and commitment. And so it's sort of very fascinating. It comes out in Ken Schmidt's book, the way his early plays really anticipate some of his major themes, and they're already alive there. And of course, that's a tendency of many 20th century philosophers. Sartre presents things in plays to try to bring it alive, and Camus in The Stranger to try to exemplify his approach. And on the more positive side, someone like Gabriel Marcel was himself a great playwright. His play, The Broken World, is very interesting, many other plays. And so Wojtyla, too, is very excellent at using examples, but that's not what's present in the acting person. That's true.
All right. Mario?
Well, I have a question. I don't know, you can give him your feedback. Perhaps you disagree with me, but when I found the personalism of Wojtyla, it seems to me then, I'm talking about the 80s, that philosophy came as a way of life, not just a theoretical effort. In other words, as you said, you are not learning principle, you are not learning prescription, you are not learning a theory, and then apply to reality, rather than begin with who you are as a being in the world. In other words, you are the one who are living the drama. You are the one who is in the world suffering all this situation or loving or whatever action you are performing there. So you are the protagonist of history. So that when you look at your own experience and try to understand and interpret it in the tradition of this person or this philosophy of the person, then you understand better who you are. Therefore, philosophy and faith, if you will, become one, integrated. And so philosophy then was not just a profession. Philosophy was not just something that you learn. Rather, philosophy is part of your own life. And therefore, philosophy has a meaning for you, and that's different from many professional philosophy who teach philosophy and their life goes someplace else. Now, I understood Wojtyla, and many others, such as Louis Penn, the great Slovene philosopher, whose book we just use precisely for that. And even, I'm going further, but I don't want to go, I found a catechism in the church who used this method. Mm-hmm. And that method is the one who changed my life. I'm talking about Father Giussani, Communion and Liberation, begin with experience. Now, you can be accused of all kinds of things. You are a modernist, you are a subjectivist, you are a relativist, and so on and so forth. Now, am I correct in my assessment, or I'm just exaggerated that point? What is your reaction to that?
Very positive and very much in line with my own experience. And when I came out of studying 2 years of behaviorism and Freudianism and humanism in psychology, I was very confused. And I think the book that really began to turn my life around was von Hildebrand's Ethics, where in this 20-page prolegomeny, he throws down the gauntlet to all forms of skepticism and relativism and says, these can be answered. And then when I got into the book, his distinction between a response to objective value forming me and moving me compared to me just being drawn by subjective satisfaction was a huge difference to me. Is there really such a thing as objective value that I ought to be formed by? That was the pivot point. And that comes up in John Paul II in his book, Love and Responsibility, when he talks about love as the only adequate response to the person, because the person deserves it, compared to being used as a pleasure object. It's a very similar distinction. Self-gift compared to use. And that turned my life around. When I was reading that in the library at Loyola, I sort of had a sense, if this guy's right, I have to reorient my whole life. And I would get up from reading his ethics, and there would be pools of sweat on the floor underneath where I was sitting, just because it was so intense. It meant so much. And that's what, got me into then the study of philosophy professionally, because I realized what it meant personally. And ultimately that the highest role of philosophy, and you can call it a handmaiden to the faith, but I call it a window onto the faith, a preamble to the faith. If you can get over some of the sort of naturalistic, materialistic, reductionistic errors of the modern age philosophically, then you can really be open to the faith. Now, another point about that, it relates to John Paul II and some of his plays, and his whole experience with Poland and World War II. Some people fought directly against the Nazis and died in defense of their country. Wojtyla originally, went into Polish language and letters as a way of trying to preserve the heritage and the heart of the country and the values of the Polish nation. And his plays always involve sort of the parallels between the suffering of Poland, which in its whole history was usually overrun and persecuted, and the parallels to that in the Jewish people in the Old Testament and Job, and then the parallels to Christ, of course, and he sort of brings all that out. And these things come out in his plays, where Poland is sort of a paradigm for the whole human race in relation to salvation history. But then, from this sort of, you can have a sort of a fighting response to evil, those who fought the Nazis. You can have an attempt to sort of build something beautiful and conserving in the arts as a response to evil. You don't let the values of your people disappear. And there's parallels here between Poland and Ireland and the production of great poets and writers who preserved the values of these peoples even when they were under oppression and practically wiped out. But then Wojtyla moved on from that. I think he moved on from this idea of creating something beautiful that preserves the values, more to the personal call for him to the priesthood. I find parallels to like Mother Teresa saying she just wanted to do something beautiful for God. And so you sort of internalize the call to preserving beauty and truth and goodness. You don't do it just in artistic works, although that's wonderful, but you're called to allow Christ to make something beautiful out of you. And so again, it's this process of internalizing that call to beauty and goodness that then again brings the philosophy alive. It makes it not just theoretical and not just beautiful in its theory, but really touching you in the heart. So, yeah.
Christopher, what next?
Well, in terms of, we were just talking about beauty, and we were kind of apropos what we were talking about before with in terms of the beginnings of philosophy. When you talk about beauty, and I don't mean to be relativist here, but I think a lot of people have very different ideas of what is beautiful. How do you go from that subjective point of what I see as the good, what I see as the beautiful, to the a more objective notion of beauty, or do you go from that? To what degree? How do we escape that subjectivity, where everything is simply, all perception of beauty is merely personally formed, and personally originated?
Yeah. Well, I'm not an expert on aesthetics, but I've never taught the class. It was one of my favorite classes in grad school, however. And I would say, of course, aesthetics is a little different from metaphysics, epistemology, even ethics, because there are not so many absolutely universal rules. It's rather more from the received form of the work that the artist is creating and that the observer can participate in, that you sort of recognize the beauty shining forth from the work of art or sculpture or music. Now, I think there's something objective there, but it's very concretely objective. And so you can't capture it so much in general theory. That's why in aesthetics, you have to use an awful lot of examples. But I think it's a parallel to the way in which each individual person is deserving of a loving affirmation and a gratitude and a rejoicing. When you look at something like the Pietà or Rembrandt's Man with the Golden Helmet, there's just something so deep and magnificent and transcendent and touching about those works that you recognize that this little piece of marble or this little canvas with colors on it is pointing way beyond itself, like that the material substrate is just the foundation for the expression of values that reach to the transcendent and the eternal. And so there's something objective there, but very concrete and individual, like each individual person uniquely deserving a special kind of love response. Now, how to answer a relativist in beauty is always difficult. And I think there many, not all, of course, but many relativists, when it comes to beauty, at least on the popular level, may not have had very many deep and genuine experiences of beauty. The aesthetic experience, which pierces you to the heart and makes you long for more and gives you a certain pain because you don't have that more, that Plato already describes, of the longing for the beautiful. I don't know that a lot of people in the world today have that kind of experience that then opens them to the idea of an objective truth about the beautiful, expressing the good and expressing the higher things. And then, then art gets interpreted more just as self-expression, self-assertion, emotional grinding. and I think that's the danger also on the level of human beings, that if our life is not stopped and turned around by a deep experience of value or beauty or love, then we tend to ride out on our own, powerful desires or fears or pride or selfishness. And sometimes we don't even realize there's something more there. And so it's tied up with the whole problem of a sort of a paucity of deep experiences in our lives. That's why returning to mystery and wonder and marveling is so important. That's why I love someone like Wojtyla and von Hildebrand and Marcel and Cardinal Newman, Kierkegaard, others, because they're always trying to bring you back to foundational experiences that you need to return to re-enliven yourself or to discover yourself for the first time. And beauty can do that. And if it happens, then you're going to have a different theory of beauty that's not going to be so low and so relativistic.
What if those foundational experiences for a particular person are of a very degraded sort? I mean, how is returning to those foundational experiences helpful?
Yeah, that's problematic. Now I think, it's easier. This is why Socrates loves dialogue. It's easier in talking with an individual person to try to fish around in their life for where they've experienced these kinds of things. There's one author, I remember, although his name escapes me for the moment, who's very disgusted with the idea of objective values and moral calls, and he's in favor more of complete human freedom and revolution and other. He condemns Mother Teresa because Mother Teresa, supposedly, you've probably heard the argument, she's making the current false structure of society look good by being saintly. And what she should be doing is participating in the revolution. And so if she's not revolting against the oppressive structures, then there's something wrong with this. He's very much in that vein. But he has a paragraph in his writings where he talks about the love he has for his daughters. And it just sort of amazes him. He says that these two human beings are inside him in such a way that he bleeds for them. He would die for them out of love for them. And what happens to them touches him so deeply. See, and so in the midst of all his other skepticism and condemnation, if you can find the spot where something has broken through, well, then maybe you can get a bit of a turnaround. And this is why in philosophy you have to tell a lot of stories. I remember Joseph Pieper. I tried to get him to Steubenville for an award and a talk one time before he died, but he said he was too old and he was taking care of his wife. But I talked to him on the phone, and I read one of his final little reflections where he said, philosophy is telling stories. And that kind of amazed me to some extent. But what he meant was you got to concretize it all. And not always stories about others. I share a lot of stories about things I've been through in my life when I teach philosophy.
Yes.
And this is what brings it alive. But you got to find a place in the skeptic you're talking to where he recognizes something like a deep beauty, a genuine value, or something precious to him. In this guy's case, it was his daughters. It could be a friend, his wife, his mother, his father, but you have to fish around and find in his experience where he's experienced these things. Because I think we all have. It's just that it gets overwhelmed by all the other things.
I'm going to do a little shift here of focus.
Sure.
Not too great a shift, but before I set out on this shift, I just want you to know that I am not going to ask you. As Cicero would put it, tacebo. I will pass over in silence the question of whether or not, given your affinity for Joseph Pieper, you would describe yourself as a peeping Thomist.
Yeah, I love those kind of designations. I consider myself in the great Thomistic tradition, yes. But I interpret it more through personalism. Yeah, but I think technically I could even qualify under the 24 Theses. I'd have to be creative about it, but I could do it.
That's not personalism.
No, but that's why you need personalism. But it doesn't deny the rest of it. So.
Well, comes now the shift. One story, and for many people it's the greatest story, is the story of their nation. And certainly John Paul was profoundly influenced by the story of the Polish nation, and in turn the Slavic people.
Uh-huh.
And one thing so distinctive about the Polish nation is that it is at the intersection of West and East.
Yes.
As is Ukraine. And just yesterday, three leaders, including, I don't know the right designation offhand, Prime Minister or President,
Poland.
The leader of Poland made a visit to Kiev.
Very courageous, yes.
To express solidarity.
Mm-hmm.
And the solidarity is in aid of, in the proper framework for, the unique value of the human person. Solidarity is not collectivism. Collectivism submerges the person. Mm-hmm. Solidarity provides the context in which the person can fully flourish. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the distinctive Slavic heritage that John Paul II had, how he acknowledged it, and what ways it provides an avenue to the right kind of philosophical reflection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a number of points there about the Slavic heritage. I mean, first, this idea that it's really a crossroads of East and West. And I think that from the very beginning gave John Paul II or Karol Wojtyla the understanding that there are different valid ways to express the truth, to express the faith. Something like the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom is this marvelous Catholic liturgy. It's not the Latin liturgy. It's not the Western Church. It's the Eastern Church, but it's beautiful and holy. And so, I mean, I think from the beginning, he had an awareness that there was more than one way to express the truth in a marvelous way. And it maybe helped instill in him this tremendous desire to heal the schism and to bring East and West together again, the church to breathe with both lungs. And I think that was a starting point for what was more universal in his life and in his tours of the world. He seemed to want to try to understand the genius and the value of each nation and culture and language and people, sort of parallel to the way in which he seems to imply each individual human being has a unique value, has something to say, something you can learn from. And so he seemed to have this deep reverence for other cultures. That's not to say they're all equal and that some aren't deeper or more glorious than others. But you never show a disdain or a denigration for another people, but a loving, reverent respect. And so it sort of, I think, opened his mind in that way. Now, beyond that, of course, the Slavic people were often persecuted. They were one of the groups beyond the Jewish people and the gypsies and 1 million Catholics who died in the concentration camps. Hitler had a particular hatred for the Slavic peoples too. And so I think Wojtyla understood from within what it meant to be prejudiced against, to be persecuted, to be looked down on. And I think a third point might be that given the crossroads throughout history and the wars that came through Poland and Central and Eastern Europe there, I think it gave John Paul II a deep understanding of the fact that if we can't have a meeting of the minds and the hearts, if we can't come to some common understanding of values, objective values, the natural law, if we can't meet in some real truths about the human race, then we're going to end up in war. If there's really no common ground of understanding, then it just becomes a free-for-all for dominance, for trying to just impose on others. And so I think he developed a deep respect for genuine dialogue without giving away what you have. I mean, he was always, very respectful of other religious traditions too, as comes out in Crossing the Threshold of Hope when he discusses Buddhism or Islam or especially the Jewish tradition. He's always deeply respectful of whatever truth there is in there. Like with Buddhism, at least they have a deep understanding of the contingency of this world. And he's always looking for things like that to affirm, even though it's very partial. And in Islam, the idea of one God, the idea of daily prayer 5 times a day, the 99 names of God, the beautiful names of God in the Quran. And yet he's never trying to equalize the religions. He says, there's a sad reduction in Islam, leaving God only majesty and never Emmanuel, never God with us, never that intimate relationship. And so, somehow I think through his early life and crossroads of East and West and his friends from the Eastern side of the church, his friends growing up who were Jewish, he developed this ability to try to understand from within the values that others may be living on that are valid, even though they may still be limited and would reach their fulfillment if they could discover, the fullness of the great tradition of the teachings of the church. He never relativized, but he always showed respect for others.
It's noteworthy, I think, that here in the United States, the church is changing its heritage in this way. We are becoming a church of Latinos, whereas in the past, we've been a European church.
Irish, Italian.
Nowhere is that more obvious apparent than in Los Angeles, California.
Sure, yeah. Well, also at Steubenville, we have a large contingent of Latino students, and we started 20 years ago to try to prepare for that more with Spanish liturgies and other such things. And so, yeah, it's very much the case. And of course, we're blessed in America that the huge influx of immigrants is Latino Christians and Catholics who are, much more compatible foundationally with, I think, the Western culture in its depth.
It's also, this is like the time after Pentecost. It's also a rare parish in Los Angeles that hasn't had a Nigerian priest serving.
Oh, yes. The same here in Steubenville. We have Nigerian priests come over to study with us for the master's degree in either philosophy or theology or both, and then they come into our parishes to help out. And generally, we've had wonderful experiences. We need this re-evangelization of America. And if it comes from Africa, that's great.
All right. Mario, what's your next thought here?
I have a question about subjectivity and subjectivism, but let me begin with what you said about Latinos. One of the phrases that John Paul II said when he visited Latin America, which was quite similar to what he said perhaps in Poland, is be yourself. Be yourself, which means, I think, if I'm correct, be faithful to your own culture. Mm-hmm. The word culture was the first word he used when he visited for the first time Latin America in Mexico, the evangelization of culture. In other words, human beings are not abstract beings, rather beings who live in the world, in their own culture. And if that culture is the one who originates the identity of the continent, be like that culture. Don't buy the whole thing of modernity, enlightenment, and all things. That's, I think, is underlying his views. Now, there is a danger in that you may interpret your culture as something subjective. And so there are as many cultures as there are people. And so what is your take on how to avoid this fall into subjectivism when we talk about cultures?
Right. First, looking at Poland, I think John Paul II knew well that the deepest inspiration for Polish culture was precisely the Catholic Church. That was the inspiration for the great cathedrals, architecture, art, sculpture, all the rest of it. And similarly in other countries, in France, in Spain, in Latin America, it's Catholic truth that people were living out and then were expressed in their own unique, concrete historical situation that's the deepest inspiration for the culture. So when he stresses the culture, it's not in a relativistic way, but as grounded in the truth. And what's so important about that, this theme of truth within culture, is that the tendency in the modern world is to treat something like Catholicism, especially as brought from Europe to the New World, as just some kind of a false imposition. That Spain and Portugal just imposed their ideas on these more natural, organic, native cultures. And then the idea is we should hate that. Let's hate the imposition that the invaders brought. Let's go back to the original. And yet, while it's true that every culture has its depth and its truths, every culture has its horrors and its mistakes. And that includes Western culture, tolerating slavery for so long, even though theoretically condemned. There's many things wrong with Western culture, but it's also true there were many things wrong with the various Indian cultures that did human sacrifice and other such things, and so it's not enough to just say, let's reject what's foreign and go back to our native Indian culture, because that leaves out the question of truth. And so I think what developed in Latin America, what certainly developed in Poland, and is still vibrant today compared to many Western countries, is this combination of the native people informed by the Catholic faith, and the Catholic faith helping to draw out from the native culture what's really valid in it. And so when the Pope speaks of being true to your culture, that's the unique creative combination of the universal truths about human nature and ethics and the universal truths about God that are partly understood philosophically, but revealed much more through the whole Judeo-Christian tradition, through Catholicism. All that is what helps form and inspire the culture. When people live the faith, that's when the culture comes alive. And so someone like St. Francis, with his simple little life, inspired cultural achievements for 800 years. Unique kinds of architecture and simplistic approaches and art and other things. And there were wonderful third order Franciscans later who are great artists. But St. Francis didn't set out to inspire culture. He set out just to imitate Christ, to follow Christ. Then that became a huge inspiration. And so there's no relativism there. It's not just subjectivism, but in culture too, like in our own lives, we have to ask what's true and valid and good and beautiful and what's not. And in terms of, in general, the question of subjectivity compared to subjectivism, subjectivism has this negative connotation of the skeptical and the relativist, as if everything I feel or everything I think is equal to what anybody else thinks just because I'm free and have dignity. That's subjectivism. But what Wojtyla means by subjectivity, and other authors in this vein all the way back to Kierkegaard, Kierkegaard has a chapter in one of his books entitled Subjectivity is Truth. And that sounds very dangerous. But what he means by it is you have to take the truth from the theoretical level down into the very depths of your being. You have to live it out with your heart and will. And that's the kind of subjectivity Wojtyla implies, the whole rich and transcendent realm of the person. But that opens you on to truth and goodness and beauty and value. So, here, if I might jump ahead, this also goes back, for instance, this sort of valuing of each individual without relativism. I think it also goes back to Wojtyla's interest in and immersion in Carmelite spirituality, which he was first introduced to by a layman, Jan Tyranowski, who was nonetheless a great spiritual. He was a tailor, but he was a great spiritual man. And then when Wojtyla first went to Rome and did his first doctoral dissertation, it was on St. John of the Cross. And it was through that study that, the idea that, that the mystics have these incredible, transcendent, deep, transforming experiences. And yet it's not just for them. It's for the rest of us. When John of the Cross or Teresa of Avila or Catherine of Siena are called out, it's as an example for the rest of us of the deepest truth about every single human being. Every human being, starting with the unborn, has the potential of John of the Cross. Most of us are never going to experience anything like that in this world, but that's our final end. That's our true greatness. That's our true majesty. And so there's an unfathomable depth to every single human being, whether he's showing it forth yet or not. That's our true nature and our true end. And this is the foundation for the culture of life, compared to the culture of death that treats human beings as just cogs in the machine, as disposable examples of the group, of the collective. And so I think his Carmelite spirituality is one of the secret well springs of his reverence for an investigation of the person.
So much there, so much. Christopher.
Sorry, I didn't mute myself. We're back pretty much at the end. You said it's for keep time, 10:58, but maybe just ask a concluding question. What's your next project?
Oh, well, I've been working. It's about the length of a master's thesis now, and I published it in a double article in a book, a couple of chapters in a book. But I'm working on an investigation into hell. And I did a couple of talks on it at the university years ago where I invited students to hell, a phenomenological analysis, and then to Hell 2, the sequel. And basically what I'm trying to do is answer von Balthasar's major questions about the traditional teachings on hell as to how anyone could be in hell if there's a perfectly loving and merciful God. And then secondly, how could I be happy in heaven if someone I dearly loved on earth ends up in hell, like my mother or my wife or my child? And he asks very powerful questions, and I'm trying to answer them. And when I say a phenomenological analysis, that doesn't mean I've been to hell, but it does mean that I think our experiences of evil in this world and of how people react and respond to evil in others or in ourselves can give us some clues as to what goes on in hell. So I've cleared my summer to try to work on that topic. I'm not teaching this summer. I want to expand it actually with more examples.
That's an arduous project.
Well, it's fascinating. I got into it after teaching the course on the nature of love for many years and the nature of community, because hell is the opposite. So by studying love and community, I got into hell.
A lot of people do.
Jim, may I interject something?
Certainly. Well, if we have
when you mention cultures and subjectivists and all that, I don't know if you are aware that today Latin America is no longer what John Paul II knew. Mm-hmm. A week ago, the new president of Chile went to a ceremony in front of 2 or 3 shamans, which is a very strange way of inaugurating an enlightenment term. Yeah. And so we are going back to the original cultures.
Right. This is
so the phenomenon is very, very strange to me. So that when you read John Paul II, you cannot help, or I cannot help myself to feel nostalgic about him.
Well, on the other hand, didn't Guatemala recently deeply reaffirm its pro-life stance about the evils of abortion? So it's being pulled apart like the rest of the world. There's some good examples and some difficult examples. But you're right. It's the general deterioration from the worldwide cultural pressures of secularism and resentment against Christianity. That's continuing to undermine many things.
Yeah.
So,
just a footnote on hell.
Yes.
Newman, and you mentioned him at the end of a Grammar of Assent as an appendix in which he discusses hell, and he entertains but does not accept the notion that those in hell don't grasp that hell is an eternal suffering. And likewise, Maritain struggled to, in some way, contextualize hell so that it would not be so utterly overwhelming. Now, it's interesting, too, that when we talk about somebody like Wojtyla, we can't help but talk about the horrific atrocities of the 20th century.
Yes.
And sometimes writers today, and I'm thinking of Marilyn McCord Adams and Alvin Plantinga from the analytic perspective, when they deal with the problem of evil, they want to focus on what they call horrendous or overwhelming evils. If you say the prayers of the hours, you say the Psalms every day. And again, the Psalms tell us that we will not be abandoned. But I'm sure if you've just been bombed in a maternity hospital in Poland, you want to say, am I not being abandoned? And all of this points to the extraordinary, powerful drama of the Christian life in the struggle against evil. And someone like Maritain himself was profoundly distressed by the relative indifference of his fellow Thomists to what was happening to the Jews. And of course, Raisa, his wife, was of Jewish heritage. And when we talk about hell, we try to bracket it in some way. And when we talk about the devil, we try to bracket that in some way. But the reality of the demonic cannot be overlooked. And it's to his credit, I think, that Pope Francis regularly draws our attention to the role of the demonic.
Yes, and Pope Benedict to the
yes, and that's, I guess, what in Europe they'd call an intervention, not a question.
Do we have a minute or two for me to make 2 points about hell?
Yes, I think we're coming to the close, but please do.
Well, on the one question, von Balthasar implies that hell is just incompatible with charity, and that the physical pains and the way it's usually depicted is just terrible and not to be accepted. In the first half of my reflections, I talk about what everybody says is the worst pains in hell, the spiritual pains of the loss of God, the loss of our fulfillment. Every part of our being is ordered toward God, and we've gone the other direction. We're ripping ourselves apart spiritually. We're utterly alone, even if there are legion. And I sort of build the case that given these spiritual pains, there's the possibility that the physical pains of hell, which would have to be great, are there not just in justice, but just like in human life where justice and charity go together, as in the problem of pain of C.S. Lewis, and even Plato talking about punishment as just, but also trying to correct. Well, there's no chance of correcting in hell, so where could charity play a role? In psychology, there's this phenomenon of people who intentionally cut or burn themselves. And they say they do it as a relief from their emotional and spiritual pain and from their loneliness. That the only way to distract themselves from their spiritual and emotional pain is to cause physical pain to distract them. And I have some studies on that. There's one lady who even said she found harming herself was more effective than heroin at distracting herself from her spiritual pains. And so I developed that idea that it's not just God piling it on with extra physical pains, because someone might say, why didn't you just leave the damned alone? It would be worse for them. And there's even a quote from, one of the exorcists of Rome was casting out the devil and made him tell the truth. He claimed they built hell. God just allowed it because they needed that distraction from their spiritual pains. Anyway, it needs to be developed much more, but that's the direction I go, that the physical pains of hell that we see so prominently in the pictures and the descriptions don't have to be just a false, vengeance, nor only a justice, but a type of mercy allowing the damned to distract themselves. And then in the second half about if someone you love is in hell, and wouldn't you want to be united with them? The problem there, of course, is that they have basically destroyed their true self. And so how can you be united with them except on their own terms? And we never experience that in this life, because no matter how far gone somebody is on earth, there's always the hope of their final turnaround, like the good thief on the cross. So we never experience anybody who is no longer able to turn around. But if there were such a thing, then there would be no chance of hoping for a reunion unless we capitulate to that person, unless we let them possess us. And I give an example from the novel Dracula, which scared me to death when I was 11 or 12 years old, when Lucy, who's been the fiancée of Jonathan, when she is made into one of the undead, and now the professor from Europe, the Catholic professor who brings the Catholic hosts over to combat, and he doesn't use the Anglican communion rite. He gets permission to bring hosts from Europe to make sure Dracula can't get back into his coffin. But in any case, Professor Van Helsing knows he cannot explain to the fiancé why he needs to finally kill Lucy. And so he brings Jonathan out to where Lucy's trying to get back into her grave before the sun comes up. And Jonathan sees the horrible caricature of what used to be Lucy, but is no longer Lucy. And then finally gives Van Helsing the permission to drive the stake into her heart. We can't understand that from our own experience, but the fact is, we would have to go over to the demonic side to be one with the person we formerly loved, who has, in the meantime, totally ruined themselves. I use an example from Star Wars too, where they say that Darth Vader murdered the father, and yet it was really the man murdering himself in the direction of evil. Of course, in the movie, he repents and comes back to the good side from the dark side. But if somebody doesn't, if they're irrevocably on the dark side, there's no way we can be in communion with them. We can still love them. God can love them with the intention of benevolence and try to make their situation as bearable as he can. And that goes back to the first point about allowing them to distract themselves through pain. Perhaps an odd thesis, but that's the direction it goes.
When you come next time through the open door, you'll have to give us an update on this, and you can also tell us how you deal with David Bentley Hart, who is perhaps now the most aggressive universalist on the theological scene. But we're going to close with the light rather than with the darkness. As always, we end with the gospel from the day, and this is Matthew. As Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, he took 12 disciples aside by themselves and said to them on the way, "Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and hand him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and scourged and crucified, and he will be raised on the third day." Then the mother of the sons of Zebedee approached Jesus with her sons and did him homage, wishing to ask him something. He said to her, What do you wish?" She answered him, command that these two sons of mine sit, one at your right and the other at your left, in the kingdom. Jesus said in reply, you do not know what you are asking. Can you drink the chalice that I am going to drink? They said to him, we can. He replied, my chalice you will indeed drink, but to sit at my right and at my left, this is not mine to give, but is for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father. When the 10 heard this, they became indignant at the two brothers. But Jesus summoned them and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and the great ones make their authority over them felt. But it shall not be so among you. Rather, whoever wishes to be great among you shall be your servant. Whoever wishes to be the first among you shall be your slave. Just so, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Come, Lord Jesus, come.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our producer will clip off this last bit. We really appreciate you taking time to join us, and we'll be knocking on your door again.
I hope so. Thank you. Very enjoyable. Nice to meet you all.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay.
Godspeed.
Godspeed. Bye-bye.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.